Have you ever sat in that heavy silence at a family dinner? Here on Women's Life Stories, we retell those moments, honest, everyday, sometimes controversial. Every story is a mirror. Subscribe, join the conversation, and maybe find a little healing. My name is Eleanor Hart, and for nearly 4 decades, I was the kind of controller who color codes receipts and files the electricity bills by season. Numbers are honest if you ask them the right questions. That morning in Savannah, the air still cool and blue. I asked a question I'd never had to ask. Where did $450,000 go? The house hadn't woken yet. The kettle clicked once, then stilled. The oak floors were cool under my soles. I carried a mug of oolong to the kitchen table and laid out the small ritual. I keep a black fountain pen, my late husband Michael's brass cufflink, the one he wore the day we signed the deed to this cottage, and a narrow ledger with a cracked spine. I touch the cufflink when I balance accounts. It reminds me steadiness can fit in something small. The screen of my banking app brightened my face. $450,000, a withdrawal stamped with a vendor I didn't recognize. The digits were stark as a winter tree. I felt no dramatic lurch, just a narrowing like the world had been turned to a point. I refreshed once, twice. The point remained. My phone buzzed. A message slid across the top and hung there as if it enjoyed the light. Sloan, thanks for the house and the Ferrari, Mom. I did not set the mug down. I did not call my son. I let the steam ribbon pass the cufflink and thought about all the times Sloan had kissed my cheek, lipstick printing a careful crescent voice, all satin and certainty. She works in brand architecture, a field that can make any shape look like a halo. Nathan met her at a fundraiser, and the night he brought her here, she put her hand on the doorframe and told me the cottage had great bones, as if she could see a future only she knew. After Michael died, their noise filled the rooms like a houseguest who insists on doing the dishes and somehow rearranges the drawers you've lived with for years. I mistook it for comfort because it sounded like laughter. The text glowed a second time in my hand. I pressed the phone dark and reached for a file folder from the sideboard. If numbers are honest, patterns are truth with a longer tail. For months, something had tugged at the tail alerts, dismissed caps, adjusted a temporary lifting of limits that never quite found the ground again. It began, if I'm honest, on an ugly night 2 years ago when Sloan called from a shoulder on I-16 engine smoking, voice shaking hard enough to loosen my grip. I had the bank add a supplementary card for emergencies only. We set a limit. We set alerts. We shook hands with guardrails. Somewhere between then and this morning, the guardrails were painted the color of the road. By 9, the bank's glass doors were flashing with reflections of live oaks. Inside, the branch manager, a woman with a wool blazer and soft eyes, led me to a small room where every sound is magnified, even the breath you tuck neatly away. We flagged the activity just before you arrived, she said, turning her monitor so we were shoulder to shoulder. Let's walk through it. We walked. There was $11,800 to a wellness atelier in Sedona, a week of bridal preparation packaged like penance for pores. $4,600 to an outfitter in Vail for a pre-wedding film shoot with a drone. A cluster of charges to a boutique that sells crib linens embroidered with constellations. $2,000 here, $2,600 there, in the neat stair-step pattern of someone who knows the height that triggers alarms. It's within authorized use technically, she said, hesitating. The card on file lists a second name, Sloan Whitaker Hart. My daughter-in-law, I said. Emergency access, she added, reading the note. I remembered the night I signed the form. I remembered telling the banker to cap single transactions at $1,000 and send me an alert for anything above half that. The manager scrolled farther down the ledger, then stopped, her mouth settling into a thin professional line. The cap was lifted last fall, she said, a phone authorization. I stared at the end point of the sentence instead of its middle. On what day? She told me. It was the week Nathan and Sloan took me to a restaurant with chairs so low you had to fall into them. Sloan smiled at the server and said, "We have so much to celebrate." She ordered champagne by pointing, never reading the price. "I can place a soft hold while we investigate," the manager said. "We'll need your statement in writing." "Please do." I signed where the page told me, the pen obedient. That night, I left the kitchen light on and opened a box I keep high in the pantry, old warranties, a small sheaf of love letters, and a velvet pouch that once held something heavy. The gold watch my father wore to the dockyard every morning had been in that pouch until the spring Nathan's first semester bill came due, and his aid office misplaced a form. I sold the watch for an amount that felt like a dare. I never told Nathan. I told myself some sacrifices are like scaffolding, you take them down after the house stands. I slept in my robe on the couch, which is to say I did not sleep. At 3, a raccoon stepped along the fence and clicked to itself like a metronome. At 4, the alley cat sang its one broken note. At 5, the birds argued about dawn. I watched the lid of the world lift by degrees and thought of Michael in the Navy, the way he'd fold his clothes to the size of a hand and say, "Order is a kindness you offer yourself when life forgets to." By daylight, I'd made coffee strong enough to begin again. I laid out the last year's paper statements in rows and used sticky flags the color of traffic lights. Green for the usual, yellow for oddities with alibis, red for anything with silk in its description. A neat red thicket grew where there should have been lawn. I remembered the day Sloane's mother phoned to say the florist had overbooked and asked if I could cover the difference to keep the vision intact. I remembered the way Sloane had squeezed my hand later and told me I was part of the brand. I remembered a boutique clerk calling me sweetheart while I signed a slip for shoes that would never know rain. I am not cruel and I am not naive. I am a woman who once counted out grocery cash in fives and kept a spare key under a clay turtle by the porch step. I'm also a woman who keeps copies of every authorization she has ever given. I pulled the original supplementary card form from the folder, traced my name where the ink had bled slightly into its own flourish, and slid it beside the phone like a witness who prefers to sit quietly until called. The cufflink winked in a stripe of sun on the table. I set my mug beside it and listened to the kettle click as it cooled, as if the house itself had paused to measure. Numbers, cufflinks, signatures, small things, but they hold. The screen of my phone stayed black. I let it. On my open ledger, I wrote 2 words in a spare margin, my hand steady as if I were adding a note about the weather account for. Then beneath that a date. And beneath that a number I have never been afraid of writing down, 450,000. I closed the book. The room didn't change, it simply became exact. By late afternoon, the light had gone the color of late peaches, and the cottage wore its hush like a well-pressed shirt. I set the ledger aside and rinsed the coffee cup until the water ran clear. Numbers behave when you give them a place to stand, people do not. When the doorbell rang 2 bright notes that felt too cheerful for the day, I already knew who it would be. Sloane stepped in without waiting for a second hello, carrying a box tied with grosgrain ribbon. Nathan followed with the posture of a man who wasn't sure whether he was visiting his mother or a client. A little something Sloane said, setting the box on the table where the cufflink rested in its small circle of sun. Cardamom brioche. Everyone's doing it. Everyone, Nathan echoed. I made tea. Sloane talked about a venue walkthrough in Bluffton, a photographer who'd shot a royal somebody, a florist who refused carnations on principle. Nathan admired the faucet as if it were a museum piece and asked in the tone of a surveyor whether the back steps were becoming a tripping hazard. When I offered them tea, Sloane smiled at her cup as if it were a camera, held it for a moment, then put it down untouched. Her gaze swam the room like a slow-moving tide. It paused at the maple hutch and the narrow drawer that sticks when you open it too quickly. "That's charming," she said, and the word tilted on its heel. She lifted a framed photograph of Michael in uniform, nodded as if she approved of his casting, and asked Nathan if they had time to swing by the boutique before the fitting. They left with air kisses. The front door closed and the cottage exhaled. I stacked plates, turned back to the hutch, and opened the sticky drawer. Inside, velvet and polish and the smell of old holidays. My mother's pewter cake server engraved with the script initials. She practiced until the curls obeyed, had been there since before we moved to Savannah, tucked into its sleeve like a kept promise. I felt the empty space before I saw it. I didn't gasp or call. The missing leaves on a tree tell you more about wind than the leaves that remain. I closed the drawer and washed Sloane's cup, though her mouth had not touched it. After dark, the kitchen window framed a square of night, and my reflection inside it, hair pinned back, shoulders neat. I pulled the banker's folder toward me and wrote a list by hand because typing feels like asking permission and ink does not. The column headings were simple: date, amount, merchant, device. I left a 5th heading with a blank line. Some truths named themselves late. On the 2nd ring, No 11 answered. His voice was the same warmth I remembered from the year he interned at the clinic, a kid with a second-hand briefcase and a suit he outgrew inside of 6 months. Back then, I'd handed him petty cash to replace a laptop that died during finals week and told him to mail me receipts when the dust settled. He never forgot to. "Mrs. Hart," he said, "you all right?" "I'm organized," I said. He didn't waste our minutes with apologies I didn't want. "Tell me what you can tell me," he said, and the steadiness in his tone made a level place for the words. I told him about the supplementary card, the lifted cap, the purchases that stepped just under thresholds as if they were measuring ceilings with a ruler. I told him my son's fiancé worked in the kind of field that repackages desire as necessity, and that a cake server went missing after a visit that smelled like cardamom and stage lighting. "Okay," he said, "we'll walk, not run. Clean record, no noise." The way he said we fit as easily as a key. He arrived the next morning in a navy suit that fit properly and shoes that declared nothing, with a leather notepad tucked under his arm. He sat where the cufflink lay, moved it a respectful inch, and listened until I had finished. Then he asked for what was needed: account statements, the original authorization for the supplementary card, any documentation of phone authorizations, and a written description of the missing item with provenance if I had it. Provenance. I could see my mother's hands through that word flour-dusted on winter afternoons, slicing cake into disciplined wedges, insisting the first piece belonged to the guest who didn't ask for it. Noah called the bank from my kitchen. He didn't posture. He introduced himself, gave his bar number, and asked whether the branch could provide a log of calls related to the cap change and a list of devices used to access the account in the last 6 months. He requested a soft hold be extended and documented pending customer dispute. He asked to escalate the case to the fraud unit without adding the word alleged to anything. When the bank employee put him on pause, he muted his end and said, "Breathe, Mrs. Hart." "I am," I said. "We'll keep it exact." He hung up and opened his notepad. 2 tracks, he said. Financial documentation, digital breadcrumbs. Breadcrumbs, I said, and thought of Sloan at my table lifting a pastry ribbon like a prize. He asked if there were shared drives or devices Sloan had ever used. I remembered the old desktop in the study we resurrected during the pandemic, the only machine that would run the label software for clinic shipments without freezing. Sloan had borrowed the login once to print escort cards for a charity event. "The password is still taped under the keyboard," I said, and hated that I said it. We carried the machine to the kitchen table as if it were another elder to be consulted. Noah's tech colleague, a woman named Gia, joined by video and guided us to extract a log of recent files, cloud syncs, and cached credentials. The screen, stubborn and a little shy, finally offered up a directory list. One folder wore my name like a coat it had borrowed Eleanor OH archive, and inside sat a spreadsheet that did not belong to me. Noah didn't change expression, but I saw the small pause he puts between breath and word when he wants to choose precisely. On the screen line, items arranged themselves in a tidy grid: retirement, bridge, property, tax, escrow, operating, contingency. A column on the right held notes in an upmarket font: passive, unwatched. Another line: cleanable, just narrative needed. I felt the cuffs of my blouse grow tight. "Print it," I said. We didn't discuss the domestic archaeology that leads a person to leave their luck taped under a keyboard. We printed and numbered and slid sheets into clear sleeves that made a sound like rain when you turn them. Noah asked me to write a factual paragraph for each document: what it was, how I obtained it, and whether anyone else had legitimate access. He wrote a request for call recordings associated with account changes and asked the bank to preserve anything within the relevant period. He typed letters with the quiet ferocity of someone tuning an instrument. We paused for lunch when the light shifted from the left window to the right, and I made turkey sandwiches with mustard that bites back. He ate standing at the sink the way young men do when they want to take up less of your house. "You're sure," he said, "not a question about love, but about resolve?" I nodded. We returned to the table and arranged the paper so that it formed a clean story without adjectives. In the late afternoon, he slid a document toward me, a sworn statement authorizing him to act on my behalf to initiate recovery of funds pending adjudication and to request immediate seizure of assets purchased through misappropriated withdrawals. Language that held. My hand did not shake when I signed. It recognized the task from 1,000 earlier signatures that kept lights on and doors working and people fed. While the printer cooled, I took the pewter cake server's empty sleeve from the hutch and placed it on the table beside the cufflink. For the record, I said and wrote the date of my mother's wedding inside the flap with the same fountain pen I use for bills. Noah photographed the sleeve from 3 angles and asked me to describe the engraving, the patina, the tiny scratch near the handle where my father's ring had kissed it 100 holidays. I told him, and the air in the room took the shape of what was missing. Before he left, he tidied his notes into a folder the color of rain and set it precisely on the edge of the table. He didn't offer promises. He shook my hand and said, "I'll file before close of day." When the door shut, the cottage found its breath again. I washed the knife I hadn't used and dried it with a towel that still smells like line sun. In the study, I taped over the password under the keyboard with a fresh strip and wrote a different word that would mean nothing to anyone but me. I placed the cufflink in my palm and felt its temperature the way it had learned the warmth of every hand that held it, and gave the warmth back in small, patient installments. At dusk, a wind lifted the live oak leaves until their pale undersides flashed, and across the table the stack of paper hummed lightly as if pleased to be in order. I opened the ledger again, the spine surrendering with the quiet of old leather, and wrote the day's entry in a column that still believed in the dignity of lines. Under account for, I added 3 short notes, the kind you write when a house speaks to itself. Cap lift, call log requested. Shared drive, unauthorized file located. Artifact missing documented. I put down the pen. Outside, a car turned the corner and did not slow. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and decided it had said enough. The screen of my phone stayed dark where I had left it. I reached for the kettle and set it on the flame. The water began to think about boiling, and the brass cufflink warmed my palm as if it had remembered its first duty to hold something together that might otherwise come loose. Noah filed before the courthouse lights flickered off. I slept in my own bed for the first time in days, and in the morning the cottage felt level as if the floor joists had decided to trust themselves again. The ledger lay closed on the table, the pen aligned with its spine, the brass cufflink warming lazily in a square of sun. I made tea, set the mug beside it, and let the steam braid with the light. By mid-morning the street had that clean late summer brightness Savannah wears when the live oaks lift their sleeves. On impulse, not habit, not ritual, I drove north along Whitaker, then out toward the new developments where mailboxes look like replicas of the houses behind them. I didn't pull into the cul-de-sac. I stopped beneath a sycamore that had not yet learned the rules of symmetry and watched. Their house had too much window and not enough shade. Sloane crossed the front room in leggings and a sweatshirt with an aspirational city printed on it, phone wedged at her shoulder, voice traveling as if it liked the echo. Nathan appeared behind her with a box, and that deferential posture I recognized from staff meetings where he wasn't sure if a suggestion was a favor or a request. Through the side window I saw something bright red catch and hold the light. The Ferrari parked on the ribbon of new concrete still wore a ceremonial bow from a showroom that sells confidence by the yard. I didn't take a photograph. I memorized the angle instead. The car's nose pointed toward the sidewalk, as if ready to behave, the bow's ribbon skewed by a wind that didn't care how much it cost. Then I drove home. At noon, Noah texted process server en route. There was nothing in the message to reassure or warn. It simply placed a fact in the day, the way paper places a line on a table and makes you move around it. The server reached their street at 2:27. I knew the time because the kettle had just clicked into quiet, and the clock above the pantry ticked in the self-conscious way clocks do when they realize their job matters again. I did not go. I had already gone. I sat at the kitchen table with the cufflink in my palm and the pewter sleeve beside it, and I listened to the old house hum. Later, Noah's email notice posted. Keys surrendered to deputy pending inventory. A second message after a small silence, vehicle included. Repossession scheduled. He did not add adjectives, and I didn't need them. Tow trucks sound like patients when they idle big-boned engines breathing in place. I heard it before I knew what I was hearing, a rumble working gently at the edge of the afternoon. Curiosity is not a virtue, but it is a faculty. I let it carry me back to the sycamore with the lazy branches and the patch of shade that only pretended to fit a car. The truck eased in with the deliberation of a man seating a heavy chair. The driver stepped down with a clipboard that had seen rain and declared nothing. He glanced at the Ferrari the way jewelers glance at stones they don't own, then at the order in his hand, and got to work. Hooks, straps, angles, the choreography of removal. Nathan came out. First, barefoot shirt wrinkled as if he'd slept horizontal on the wrong hour of the day. Hey, he called, voice pitched to friendly misunderstanding. You've got the wrong address. Not what this says, the driver answered without heat. Sloane followed in a robe that looked like it had thoughts about itself. Sir, that's a private vehicle, she said. My husband's. The driver didn't argue. He pointed at the seal on the order with a thick finger, as if it were a star on a map, and he'd seen enough nights to trust it. Court directive, he said. If you'd like to take pictures, take pictures. Sloane's mouth opened and closed around 3 words, mistake, permission, gift, none of which had hinges in the places she wanted. Nathan reached for her elbow. She shook him off without looking. The tow winch began its low metal hum, the sound of intentions changing shape. The car rose an inch, then another. Sloane swayed forward, fingers hovering over the hood, as if touch could argue. Nathan stepped back, then farther back, until his heels found the grass, and he felt the small startle of cool. He looked up and around, and for a moment that had no flourish in it, saw my car under the sycamore. Our eyes met like 2 lines finding their common number. He did not raise a hand. He did not ask me to stop anything. He looked, and then he looked away. When the Ferrari settled onto the truck bed, the driver checked the straps with ordinary care, tapped the order back into its sleeve, and climbed into the cab. Sloane's voice reached after him, not sharp now, thin, and then dropped as if it had run out of rail. Nathan turned and walked toward the house. He didn't slam the door. He didn't steady it. He let it find itself. I drove home along the same streets, past the same polite trees. The afternoon felt taller, not lighter. At the cottage, I put water for tea and set the cufflink in its dish, the small metal warmth doing its one job without commentary. The knock came just after dawn the next day, the kind neighbors reserve for true emergencies and salesmen never learn. The brass on the door was cool under my hand. Through the peephole, Sloane, hair-damp robe tied, wrong eyes swollen into something less precise than pretty. She pressed her forehead to the wood and said my name the way people say the first word that fits Eleanor. The door knows me better than my face. It has absorbed every weather I couldn't control and every gentle exit I could. I stood with my palm against it and did nothing with the latch. On the other side, breath hitched, steadied, failed. I didn't know, she said softer. I didn't mean... Then sentences unspooled without subjects. I let them run out. Tea cools with or without company. I lifted my mug and took a sip that had already lost its edge. Her body slid down the outside of the door until fabric met the choir mat and stayed there. My hand stayed where it was, learning the temperature of the brass, again the old kindness of a shape made to be held. When the house shifted the way old houses do, settling, remembering. I stepped back and set the mug beside the ledger. The knocks did not come again. Noah's messages turned to calendar entries. Hearing set. District courtroom, second floor. Bring ID. Nothing in the fonts or the margins suggested scale, and that helped. Courtroom light is different from every other light. It knows it has work to do. The benches smelled faintly of polish and the floor of something just shy of antiseptic. A deputy stood near the back with the watchfulness of a man who had learned how to be visible and invisible at once. Noah met me at the aisle and guided me to the plaintiff's table with the compact nod of someone who understood that escorting is not owning. Across the aisle, Sloane sat with a lawyer I didn't know. Her hair bound into a version of itself designed for sincerity, her face wearing less opinion than I had ever seen it hold. Nathan sat behind her, one row back, as if hedging the bet on proximity. He stared at the floor too long, then at his folded hands, then nowhere at all. The judge took her seat without claiming the room. She didn't have to. Noah stood and read the pleadings as if he were listing ingredients for something the room already knew how to bake. Unauthorized access, misappropriated withdrawals, assets acquired through those withdrawals. He didn't decorate the sentences. He held them the way you hold wire firmly with gloves. Sloane's counsel spoke about misunderstandings and informal family practices that blur formal lines. He suggested the supplementary card had created expectations. He'd done his work, the presentation had cadence. Noah called his first witness Ruth Calder. Ruth had managed the clinic's operations longer than any of us had managed our own marriages. She walked to the stand the way she walks to everything, straight, unhurried, with a politeness that never asks permission to be taken seriously. She swore and adjusted the microphone one notch and folded her hands. Ms. Calder, Noah said, how long have you worked with Mrs. Hart? 12 years, she answered, 13 in November. He asked her to describe in her own words my habit of keeping records. She smiled without fondness or irony. If you ever borrowed $10 from petty cash, she said she would staple your IOU to a Post-it and tape the Post-it to a copy of the staple receipt. And then she'd ask if you needed bus fare anyway. The small sound that moved through the gallery wasn't laughter so much as release. Ruth went on the two desks we squeezed into my office so Nathan could do homework without losing me to evening clinic hours. The cakes I ordered from the same bakery every April for Sloane's birthday, whether she came by or not. The blanket I kept under the window seat for the nights the clinic snowed in its own way and I stayed. Noah steered her gently to the last 6 months, the charges, the pattern, the device access, the day she found the pewter sleeve empty when she was polishing the hutch for Thanksgiving, not to accuse, just to answer when the court asked who had last seen what. Sloane's counsel objected to relevance. The judge allowed the testimony without speech. Ruth stepped down with the same composure she had carried up. Noah called me. On the stand, the microphone smelled of tin and someone else's clone. I stated my full name and occupation and offered my age only because the form required her number. Noah's questions were simple. Did I add a supplementary card? Yes. For what purpose? Emergencies. Was the cap lifted? Yes. By whom? A phone authorization I did not make. Did I recognize the spreadsheet found on my old desktop? Not as something I had made. I recognized the names of my own accounts and the syntax of someone assessing whether the guardrails were painted or removed. Mrs. Hart, Noah said, did you make a demand before filing this action? I asked the bank to place a soft hold and preserve logs, I said. I did not contact the defendants. Why not? Because the paper had already said what needed saying. He didn't ask for embellishment. He thanked me and sat. Sloane's attorney rose and asked me whether I had ever used the phrase, family is a brand, in her presence. I had not. He asked whether I had ever given her a budget for the wedding. I had not. He asked whether my refusal to give a budget constituted in her mind an implied assent to absorb overages. I did not answer for her mind. He asked whether I loved my son's wife. The judge sustained Noah's objection before I had to decide what verb fit. In closing, Noah didn't grandstand. He held the printed pages up by their corners as if displaying the lace on a tablecloth for flaws. The judge took notes in a small private hand. The gallery sound changed when decisions entered it, a kind of listening that makes space. The judge ruled without performance. an order issuing a return of funds pending further adjudication, a seizure of assets demonstrably acquired through unauthorized withdrawals to be held until disposition, a no-contact stipulation 5 years with allowances for counsel and required legal communications, probationary oversight for Sloan on matters touching fiduciary access. The language was granular and unkind to loopholes. It did not sentence. It simply turned the paper I had carried for months into something Stone understands. Sloane's mouth rounded into the shape catastrophe chooses when it has run out of choreography. Nathan gathered his jacket and did not put it on. Noah touched my elbow in a way that didn't ask for anything and guided me toward the aisle. On the way out, Ruth fell into step beside us, as natural as breath. In the corridor, the light was cleaner than the light inside. People held their folders to their chests as if to steady the factual hearts inside. We didn't speak in the elevator. The building doesn't like it when people speak there. It prefers sighs and the soft slap of legal shoes. On the sidewalk the city picked up, where it had left off traffic making its endless small treaties, a child refusing a stroller with rigor, a dog choosing a lamppost with ceremony. The day had room again. At home, the cottage received me with the old grace that happens when things have belonged to each other for a long time. I slid the order into the front of the ledger, not to hide it, but because that is where decisions live. I placed the cufflink on top of the closed book and watched how the metal learned the pages cool quickly and then returned warmth to it in precise degrees. I made soup from the thing the refrigerator offered and ate it without noticing most of its names. The night moved across the ceiling with its reliable gait, and when I turned out the lamp, the room did not argue. 2 days later, a sealed notice went up on the couple's front door. I didn't go to see it. I didn't need the picture of it in my mind to know where it stood, or which corner the adhesive would snag on when someone tried to pull it clean. I trimmed the basil on my windowsill instead and placed 3 leaves on the cutting board like a small finger's worth of green ceremony. The kettle clicked and I pressed the bowl of the spoon to the leaves and dragged once, releasing what they had meant to keep to themselves. Ruth stopped by with a stack of manila folders and the kind of smile you give when you've carried heavier things. We sat at the table and did the work that comes when a house has spoken and people must now write down what the house said. She labeled inventory sheets, I initialed margins. We both signed chain of custody forms with the abbreviated patience of women who have been asked for their signatures enough times to stop being impressed by the lines. When she left the cottage, took a long, clean breath. I wiped the table as if it were the brow of someone who had just finished a difficult task and wasn't ready to sleep. The cufflink winked and went quiet again. A small sound came from the porch mail in the slot, then a retreating footstep, and I found a thin envelope addressed in a neat, eager hand I didn't recognize. I set it under the weight of the ledger without opening it and stood in the doorway for a while, looking out at the hydrangea that believed in its own blue with new sincerity. That evening, the phone lay face down on the sideboard where the old desktop used to hum. Light from the last corner of the day found the pewter sleeve and made it gleam like a statement. I lifted it, ran a finger inside the empty pocket, and pictured my mother's hands again. The certain angle of her wrist. The rigid rightness with which she offered the first slice to whomever hadn't asked. The missing object was not an ache, it was a fact with an outline. Some outlines teach a person where their edges are. Night arrived like a competent flyer. I wrote the day's notes in the ledger, not a speech, not a story, just the pieces that belonged to accounts. Order executed. Keys surrendered. Vehicle removed. Hearing concluded. The calm looked like itself again. I set the pen down and listened to the cottage remember itself. The hum in the walls. The shy plumbing clearing its throat. Somewhere in the alley, a bottle rolled on its side and learned the street's slope. I turned the cufflink once, twice, until it chose a face to present and held it. The brass kept its warmth, and I kept mine. The ledger lay between us with the slow confidence of made things. The room was not lighter nor darker, it was exact. For a week after the hearing, the cottage behaved as if it had been waiting to exhale. Doors settled on their hinges with less argument. The refrigerator stopped its theatrical humming and kept to a modest purr. In the mornings, I watered the hydrangea and trimmed basil with the back of a spoon, then let the cut leaves rest in the shallow dish where the brass cufflink slept. The ledger lived open to a clean page. I didn't rush to fill it. Noah came by with a banker's box and the precise sort of calm you bring to a room you respect. He set the box on the table and unpacked forms without sighs. Receipts lived in sleeves. Orders wore their embossed seals like quiet punctuation. Chain of custody acknowledgments, he said, tapping 3 places with the tip of his pen. He didn't narrate what anyone might feel about any of it. He didn't have to. Ruth arrived with ginger cookies she claimed were medicinal, and a roll of painter's tape for labeling. We worked in companionable fragments. She listed the household items subject to inventory review. I initialed the margins and dated corners. The pewter sleeve rested between us like a witness that had already given its statement and chosen not to embellish. By the fourth folder, Ruth paused and looked up, eyes clear. "Anything you need me to take to storage?" "Not yet," I said. "Good," she answered. "Houses should have time to understand themselves." After they left the cottage, did what old buildings do when they're trusted again. It listened back. I wiped the table with slow circles and stacked the signed pages so their edges aligned. The cufflink caught a narrow band of afternoon and kept it. I laid my palm over the metal and let it teach me its patience. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. No return address. Just my name in a hand that wasn't young, but had practiced looking young, rounded even careful where it once might have been clever. I carried it to the kitchen and placed it beside the kettle, then turned the flame low. Steam rose in a disciplined column, and when the kettle voiced its thin agreement, I shut it off and opened the envelope. "Eleanor, I'm writing because speaking tilts the ground under me, and writing does not." The first paragraphs walked in small steps. A facility outside Hilton Head, a counselor with a pocket watch who kept time without looking at it. Sessions where silence did more than any prompt. The letter didn't ask for reversal. It didn't rename what had already earned its names. It offered dates and verbs, a few nouns that would sit anywhere, shame, hunger, sleep. I read to the end without letting my eyes jump ahead. "I stole from you because I thought I was owed a life I didn't know how to build. I used what you'd kept safe to decorate a story I wanted to star in. I didn't plan to say any of that out loud. Paper lets me." The signature was careful and plain Sloan. No last name, as if the one she had been borrowed and needed to be returned before it could be used again. I folded the letter and placed it inside the ledger behind the latest page, not to hide it, but to keep it from blowing away when the window invited in a breeze. Then I made tea and stood at the sink, watching the hydrangea decide between two shades of blue. The next day, a car I recognized pulled into the curb with the soft reluctance of someone who had practiced turning around and decided against it. Nathan stood on the walk with his jacket over the one forearm unbuttoned, unsure, while the sun reached around a cloud and made him blink. I opened the door because the door knows the difference between noise and a person who has remembered how to knock. "May I speak with you?" he asked. "You may," I said, and stepped aside only far enough to keep the room from being crowded by our history. He didn't come in. He kept one foot on the porch boards, one on the top step, as if the house had boundary lines painted across its threshold. I signed what Noah sent, he said. The account reconciliations, the titles, the storage inventory. "Thank you," I said. He swallowed and looked past me at the table. "You still keep the cufflink out." "It helps," I said. He nodded as though that explained everything and nothing. "She's..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't ask me to finish it for him. "I wanted you to know I see what happened. Not just the part everyone can point to." The porch took his weight when he shifted. The board under his heel made the same sound it made when he was 12 and came back from the creek with shoes he pretended not to have ruined. Nothing about him asked for consolation. He had learned how to stand without leaning, and that was enough. "Take care of yourself," I said. "You too," he answered, and managed a half-smile that didn't betray anyone. When he left, the porch released a small, satisfied creak. I closed the door and let the latch find its seat. The house kept its level. 2 Saturdays later, Ruth convinced me to attend a community luncheon at the fellowship hall behind the clinic. Long tables wore plastic cloths that pretended to be gingham. The coffee tasted like a well-meaning deacon had measured it with his thumb instead of a scoop. I sat near the end with a plate of chicken salad and watched volunteers build pyramids from paper cups as if balance were a game. Someone asked if I would say a few words. I shook my head and pushed the plate an inch so it wouldn't seem like refusal had killed my appetite. There are days to fill rooms and days to keep them intact. I had chosen mine. A woman I didn't know took the chair beside me and began telling me how hard numbers were for her, as if I were a person who had always trusted calculators to sing the right tune. I listened. I nodded when nods were called for. When she finished, she placed her hand on mine for 1 second and said, "You look like someone who knows where her keys are." It was the best compliment I had received in a year. On the walk home, the sun pressed itself into my shoulders, the way heat does when it wants to know if you're sturdy. I stopped at the market for peaches that smelled like their own idea of August, and a loaf of bread with a crust that would teach a person to chew with attention. The shopkeeper wrapped the peaches in paper with newsprint bleeding through and called me Ms. Hart, the way a person calls you that because your name ring has been earned. At the cottage, I set the fruit on the counter and washed 2 mugs, even though I would use only one. Habits do not always require company to justify themselves. I sliced a peach and ate it over the sink juice running into the place my palm remembers as a bowl. The ledger lay open. I wrote 2 words in the corner of the page, postmark kept. It meant nothing to anyone but me. It meant I had not misplaced the letter. I had not misplaced myself. In the evenings, I sat on the back step with the cat from 2 houses over, pretending not to be mine. We watched a part of the sky the streetlights forgot. If Noah called, I answered. If he didn't, I poured tea. The pewter sleeve stayed on the hutch where it could be seen and not mistaken for a need. The cufflink warmed under my thumb. On a Wednesday, a parcel arrived from the storage facility, photographs taken during the inventory. Each picture was printed with a white border a thumb wide, each labeled in the careful handwriting of a person who had learned that labels are a kind of respect. A frame containing Michael in his uniform kept. A box of linens kept. A set of candlesticks from a thrift shop we pretended was an estate sale kept. The pewter cake server missing. The photograph of the missing item showed a square of velvet where the outline had compressed the nap. The space had contours. You could almost measure it. I slid the photographs into a cloth album I hadn't used since Nathan's shoulder was small enough to carry without asking. The album made a comfortable sound when it closed like a drawer with felt runners. I put it on the shelf under the hutch and didn't think about it again. That night, rain came without bargaining, straight down, earnest, steady. The cottage brightened under it the way some faces do when they're clean and no longer performing. I opened the back door and let the smell of wet dirt come in. On the table, the ledger's pages curled a fraction, not enough to protest, just enough to register the weather. I flattened them with the side of my hand and left them as they were. A final letter came near the end of the month, forwarded from Noah's office with a sticky note that said, "Only for your file if you want it." The return address this time belonged to a sober living house with a name that tried too hard to be gentle. I read the postmark first, then I opened the envelope. Eleanor. I didn't write to ask you to change anything. I'm writing to mark that I am learning how to live inside my own name. That's all. It was shorter than the first and steadier. A few lines about work in the kitchen, chopping, measuring, washing dishes until the water turned cool. A paragraph about a woman in the next room doing the same. A sentence admitting hunger, the good kind. The signature looked less practiced, more owned. I pressed the crease with my thumbnail, then slipped the page into the ledger behind the first letter. Paper does not forgive, it retains. But it holds in a way that lets a person set it down. The inventory concluded quietly. Noah sent a summary with bullet points that respected their own brevity. Funds began their return trip in installments that landed and sat without flourish. The court calendar made room for tighter language where it had been loose. Ruth and I cleared the sideboard of anything that no longer needed to be at reach. The house lightened in measures too small to photograph. On an early evening that had borrowed its color from peaches again, I set the table for one without apology. A bowl deep enough for soup, a plate for bread, the small knife with the handle that fits my thumb. The radio murmured from the other room. Not news, just a station that plays songs, built like reliable chairs. I ate slowly. The bread fought back in a way that made it clear it had done its part. I washed the dishes and left them to dry without arranging them in anticipation of other hands. Before the light disappeared, I took the ledger from the table and carried it to the hutch. The brass cufflink came along warm as a coin someone has held during a long conversation. I set the book on the middle shelf next to the cloth album and placed the cufflink on top of it. The pewter sleeve leaned in the corner where it could rest without persuading anyone of anything. In the study, the old desktop sat quiet under its dust cover. I lifted the corner, checked that the taped-over password still said nothing useful to anyone but me, and let the cover fall back into place. The cat from 2 houses over peered through the window and blinked. I blinked back. When night settled, it did not ask for witness. The cottage chose the darkness it wanted and left the rest for the street. I turned off the lamp and listened while the house spoke the language of settled wood and satisfied plumbing. In bed, I lay on my side, facing the window where the shape of the hydrangea printed itself in darker blue on black. Rain threatened once and reconsidered. The cufflink back on its new perch borrowed the last heat from the day and gave it up in small measured degrees. I slept. In the morning, I would water the basil and note the ledger page by its weight alone. The house had learned its quiet. I had learned mine. The tea would steam. The pen would wait. The numbers would sit exactly where they had been placed, ready to answer honest questions. And the sun, obliging as ever, would find something small to warm. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. If this story resonated with you or made you reflect, I'd love to hear your thoughts, so feel free to share them in the comments below. And don't forget to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you won't miss the next story. I'll see you next time as we continue exploring more journeys and lessons together.